There is something happening inside you that you have not yet been able to name. It is not a feeling, exactly not in the way you have always experienced feelings, as things that arrive with force, demanding attention, pulling you towards someone else's gravity. This is quieter than that. It moves the way underground water moves, not visible, not dramatic, but reshaping the terrain from beneath. You may have noticed it first as a kind of hesitation, a half-second pause before you said yes to something you would have once agreed to immediately, automatically, without registering that a choice was even being made. Or perhaps you noticed it as a new and faintly uncomfortable silence inside you when someone you love became upset. A silence where there used to be immediate activation, immediate reaching, immediate marshalling of your emotional resources toward their distress. That silence unsettled you. It felt like failing at something. It felt like coldness. But it was neither of those things. What you were experiencing, what you are still in the middle of experiencing, is the beginning of a structural shift in the architecture of your psyche. And because it is structural, because it is happening at a level beneath conscious intention, it does not feel like growth, it feels like loss, like dislocation, like something essential being removed from a load-bearing wall. Jung understood the psyche not as a collection of feelings or behaviors, but as a system, a living, dynamic system with its own economy, its own logic, its own momentum, and like any system, it tends toward equilibrium. The question that Jungian psychology forces you to ask is not what do I want, but rather what has the system I am part of been organized to produce. Because you did not arrive at your patterns of emotional availability, your sensitivity to others' unspoken states, your compulsive movement toward the distressed or the needy. By accident, you arrived there through a process of adaptation, a process that was, in the truest sense of the word, intelligent. It was the intelligence of a young organism calibrating itself to survive within a specific emotional environment. And that calibration was so thorough, so complete, so deeply woven into your sense of self, that you eventually stopped experiencing it as adaptation and began experiencing it as identity. You stopped knowing that you had learned to be this way. You came to believe that you simply were this way. This is the first thing that must be understood. And it must be understood not intellectually but viscerally, in the body, in the specific texture of memory the person you became was constructed. Not falsely, there is nothing inauthentic about the depth of your feeling, the reality of your sensitivity, the genuine care you carry for others. But the particular shape that sensitivity took, the particular direction it learned to flow, the particular relationships it learned to seek, that was formed. It was formed in response to a specific emotional field, and that field had a name. It had faces. It had patterns that repeated at the dinner table, in the car, in the long silences between parents that a child learns to read like weather, and the child you were read that weather with extraordinary precision. Because your survival, not physical survival, but the deeper survival of attachment, of belonging, of being loved depended on your accuracy. Here's the ordinary scene that will be familiar to you. even if the specific details differ. You are perhaps 7 or 9 or 11 years old. There is tension in the house, the particular tension that does not announce itself, but fills every room like barometric pressure dropping before a storm. No one has said anything is wrong. No one will. The adults in your life perhaps did not have the language for it, or the willingness, or perhaps they themselves were so accustomed to managing feeling through suppression or displacement that direct acknowledgement was genuinely not available to them. But you feel it. You feel it before you understand what you are feeling, and you have learned through repetition, through consequence, through the quiet feedback loop of family systems, that when you feel it, you move toward it, you find the parent who is distant, and you bring them something. A question, a drawing, a funny observation, anything that creates contact. You find the parent who is tense and you become good, preternaturally good, invisible in your needs, ambient in your helpfulness. You become the emotional regulator of a system that never asked you to be and never acknowledged that you were. And it worked, not always, not perfectly, but enough that the pattern reinforced itself, grew roots, became reflex. Jung's concept of the complex is precise here. And it is worth understanding not as a theoretical abstraction, but as a description of something that lives in you and operates with a kind of autonomous intelligence. A complex is not simply a set of painful memories. A complex is a cluster of psychic material memories, emotions, image, behavioral patterns organized around an emotionally charged core. And that cluster has energy. It functions almost like a subpersonality with its own characteristic responses, its own perceptual filters, its own way of moving through the world. The mother complex, as Jung described it, is organized around your earliest and most formative experience of the feminine principle as it was embodied or failed to be embodied in your primary caregiver. And because that experience was the template for safety, for nourishment, for the basic felt sense that the world would receive you, it became the lens through which you unconsciously evaluate every subsequent relationship. Not consciously, the complex does not operate in the light of consciousness. It operates beneath it, shaping what you notice, what you are drawn to, what feels like home even when home was not safe. If your mother, and here the word is used not moralistically but functionally, to describe whoever occupied that primary caregiving role, was emotionally unavailable, was depressed, was anxious in ways she could not contain, was wounded in ways that meant her attention moved toward her own pain more reliably than toward yours, then something was formed in you. The complex formed around the experience of love as something you had to reach for, something that required your effort, your attunement, your careful management of yourself in order to be received. Love became conditional, not in a cruel way, perhaps not even consciously on her part, but structurally conditional, available most reliably when you were not too much, when you were helpful, when you did not add to the weight she was already carrying. And so you learned to be less, you learned to give more, You learn to read the emotional temperature of a room with the sensitivity of a precision instrument, and to adjust yourself accordingly. This was love. This was belonging. This was the only template you had. The father complex operates along a different axis but with equally profound consequences. The father, in Jungian psychology, represents not the literal man but a principle, the principle of limit, of structure, of the world beyond the immediate nest, of authority both external and internal. When that principle is absent through literal absence, through emotional unavailability, through the particular kind of distance that some men carry as a second skin, learned from their own fathers and their fathers before them, a specific wound opens. It is the wound of unwitnessed becoming. You did not have the experience of being seen by a structuring presence, being recognized as capable, being given the message reliably and consistently that you could trust your own judgment, that your authority over your own inner life was legitimate, and without that experience, the inner father, the internal structure that should eventually take over the function the outer father was meant to model, remains underdeveloped. You become someone who is extraordinarily attuned to others, but poorly defended in relation to your own interiority. You can feel everyone else's emotional weather with painful clarity, but you struggle to locate your own ground. You are all antenna and no root. This is the unconscious bargain, and you need to see it clearly somewhere in your early development. You made a trade, not deliberately, not consciously, but the psyche made this trade as a survival calculation. And the terms were these: I will give you my attention, my emotional labor, my capacity for attunement, my needs set aside. In exchange, I will receive proximity, I will receive a version of love, I will receive the felt sense that I belong, that I matter, that I am necessary, and the critical word there is necessary, because necessary was the closest available approximation to loved. Necessary was what was on offer. And so the psyche, with its characteristic pragmatism, accepted it. You became necessary. You became the one who held things together, who absorbed the overflow, who bridged the distance between people who could not bridge it themselves, who remained steady when others could not, who felt everything so that others did not have to feel as much. You became indispensable in a specific emotional economy, and indispensable for a long time felt like enough. The cost of that bargain only becomes visible much later, and even then it tends to reveal itself not as a single recognition, but as a series of them, each one arriving a little deeper than the last. The first recognition is usually relational. You notice with a kind of exhausted bewilderment that you keep ending up in the same dynamic. The faces change, the circumstances change. Sometimes it is a romantic partner, sometimes it is a close friend, sometimes it is a colleague who gradually expands to fill whatever emotional space you make available, but the structure is identical. There is someone whose emotional needs are large and consistently prioritized. There is you, moving toward those needs with your characteristic precision and care, There is a gradual erosion of your own interior space. So gradual, you rarely mark the moment it begins. Only the moment if you are fortunate. If something in you refuses to continue disappearing when you look up and realize you cannot find yourself anymore, this is not weakness. This is not a failure of discernment, though it will feel that way. This is the complex operating with its full autonomous force, and it is doing precisely what it was designed to do. It is recreating the conditions of your original attachment, because those are the conditions in which you learn to be. The dynamic is not random. The dynamic is from the perspective of the unconscious. Familiar and familiar is not the same as good, but it carries a particular form of comfort, the comfort of known territory. The comfort of a role you know how to play with a kind of terrible fluency. And there is something else here that is harder to admit, something that requires genuine honesty in these dynamics. You also receive something, not what you deserve, not what you actually need, but something. You receive the experience of being needed. You receive the role of the one who sees clearly, who loves deeply, who gives generously. You receive, at an unconscious level, the confirmation of your own identity as the capable, sensitive, emotionally generous one, and that identity, however costly, however constructed in the service of survival, has become the architecture of your self-concept. To give it up feels like self-destruction, even when holding on to it is the actual mechanism of your diminishment. There is a particular moment that many people in your position can identify, though they rarely name it accurately when it first occurs. It is the moment when you said something honest, not cruel, not dramatic, simply honest about what you needed, or what you would no longer do, or what was not working for you. Perhaps it was quiet, perhaps it was delivered with the careful, measured tone of someone who has rehearsed restraint for decades, and the response you received was not engagement, it was not curiosity, it was not even anger. Exactly, anger would have been cleaner, more legible. What you received was something more destabilizing than anger. You received collapse, or withdrawal, or a sudden, total rearrangement of the other person's emotional atmosphere that made it unmistakably clear that your honesty had done damage, that your boundary had been experienced as an act of violence. And what happened inside you in that moment is the thing that deserves the most careful attention. Because what happened was not relief at having spoken truthfully. What happened was a lurch of guilt, so immediate, so physical, so automatic, that it arrived before thought, before you could even process what you had said or evaluate whether it was reasonable. The guilt came first. The guilt always came first. And that guilt is not a moral signal. That guilt is the complex speaking. And it is saying the same thing. It has always said you are responsible for what others feel. You are responsible for managing the emotional consequences of your own existence. This is the mechanism that must be examined with precision, because it is the mechanism that has organized your relational life more completely than any conscious decision you have ever made. The belief, and it is a belief, not a truth, even though it is lodged so deeply that distinguishing it from truth requires sustained effort. The belief is this: that your authentic self, The self with needs and limits and honest perceptions is too much, is damaging, is the cause of suffering in others, and therefore that self must be managed, contained, translated, softened before it is permitted to exist in relational space. You learned this early. You learned it not through a single lesson, but through 1,000 small calibrations, each one so minor that none of them registered as instruction, but collectively they constituted a thorough and systematic education in self-erasure. You learned that when you were upset, the adults around you became more upset, and so your upset became a secondary problem on top of whatever had originally caused it. You learned that when you had needs, those needs created burden, visible burden, the kind that showed in a face or a sigh or a sudden change in the quality of attention. And so your needs became something to be ashamed of, to be minimized, to be addressed only after everyone else's needs had been met, which was rarely. You learned that your perceptions, when they named something true that someone did not want named, produced consequences, not always dramatic consequences, but the quiet, devastating consequence of suddenly becoming less visible, less warmly regarded, less securely held in the relational field. And so your perceptions, too, learn to wait, learn to check themselves against the emotional temperature before being released. Jung described the persona as the mask we develop for the purpose of social navigation to the face we present to the world, that is crafted in response to what the world seems to require of us. For most people, the persona is a layer real enough to be functional, distinct enough from the core self that some separation between the two remains possible. But for you, the process went further. The adaptation was not superficial, because the emotional environment of your origin required not merely a social mask, but a fundamental reorganization of what you were permitted to be. The persona and the shadow, the parts of yourself that were deemed unacceptable and therefore pushed into unconsciousness, became disproportionately loaded. The shadow grew heavy with everything that could not be expressed: anger, particularly because anger in sensitive children raised in emotionally volatile or emotionally avoidant homes is among the earliest and most thoroughly suppressed experiences. Anger requires a self that trusts its own perceptions enough to say, "This is wrong. This is too much. I will not accept this." And you were trained systematically to doubt exactly that, to wonder whether you were being too sensitive, too dramatic, too difficult, to absorb the gaslighting. And that word is used here not as a fashionable accusation, but as a precise description of what happens when a child's accurate perceptions are consistently overridden by the emotional needs of adults, as though it were information about reality rather than information about the limits of those around you. So the shadow became your anger and your authority and your right to occupy space without justification, and your capacity to disappoint people without experiencing it as catastrophe. These were not lost. Nothing in the psyche is ever truly lost, which is both the burden and the possibility of this work, but they were submerged, they went underground, and because they went underground without being integrated, without being understood, without being consciously worked with, they began to operate from below in the only ways available to submerged material: through the body, through compulsive patterns, through the relentless magnetism that drew you toward dynamics that would recreate the original conditions under which those parts of you had been exiled. This is the mechanism of projection and shadow attachment, and it operates with a precision that, once understood, becomes impossible to ignore. Consider the kind of person you have repeatedly found yourself in close relationship with. Not universally, there are always exceptions, always relationships that do not fit the pattern, but in the relationships that have marked you most deeply, that have consumed the most of your emotional energy, that have left you most depleted and most confused about your own worth. Consider those people. What they often share is a particular quality of emotional expansiveness, not expansiveness as generosity, but expansiveness as occupation. They take up space. They have strong feelings that they express with a directness that you, with your carefully managed self-expression, find both alarming and secretly fascinating. They are not as concerned as you are about managing impact. They assert their needs without the elaborate scaffolding of justification that you have always felt necessary before speaking your own. And some part of you, the submerged part, the exiled part, the part that went underground decades ago because it was not safe to remain visible, is drawn to that quality. Not because you consciously admire it, but because it carries the energy of your own unlived shadow. This is not a flattering recognition. It is not meant to be. Jungian depth psychology is not in the business of flattery. What it offers instead is accuracy. And the accurate description of this dynamic is that you have been unconsciously drawn to people who carry in their behavior and their emotional style the qualities that live in your own shadow, the unapologetic neediness, the loud self-priority, the willingness to consume relational resources without accounting, because at the deepest level, the psyche is always seeking wholeness. It is always trying to integrate what has been split off. The tragedy is that it attempts this integration through projection rather than through inner work, which means that instead of reclaiming your exiled anger, your exiled authority, your exiled right to need and take and occupy, you remain in orbit around someone else who carries those qualities for you, at enormous cost to your own vitality. Here is the ordinary scene. You are sitting across from someone you love, a partner, a close friend, a sibling, and they are describing a problem. The problem is familiar to you. In fact, it is the same problem they described 3 weeks ago, and 3 weeks before that, and you gave the same careful, warm, precise attention to it. Then, as you are giving now, you are good at this. You know how to hold someone's distress without being overwhelmed by it, or rather, you know how to perform that steadiness, because internally you are absorbing everything. You are taking it in through your skin, the way you have always taken in the emotional content of the people around you, and somewhere in the middle of their description. You notice something, a faint pulse of something beneath the attentiveness, beneath the care, something that might, if you let it surface, turn out to be tiredness or resentment or the specific, quiet grief of recognizing that no equivalent space exists for you in this dynamic, that when you have tried to bring your own difficulty, the conversation has a way of returning not cruelly, not deliberately, but inevitably to them. You notice this, and then, with a speed that is almost invisible to yourself, you suppress it. You bring yourself back to attention. You continue giving because the alternative, letting that pulse become a voice, letting that voice say something true about what this is costing you, feels at the level where the complex operates like the destruction of the relationship, like being the person who fails at love. But what you are actually failing at in that moment is not love. What you are failing at is self-location. The psyche has a function that might be described as the capacity to know where you end and another person begins, not as a philosophical proposition, but as a lived, moment to moment somatic reality. That function in you was compromised early because in an emotional environment where your boundaries were not modeled, were not respected, were not even acknowledged as real, the boundary between your emotional experience and the emotional experience of those around you became genuinely porous. You did not develop the ordinary neurological scaffolding that allows most people to feel another person's pain without experiencing it as their own. You became what is sometimes called an empath, and while that word has been so thoroughly claimed by certain kinds of spiritual self-help discourse that it has lost precision, the underlying reality it describes is not mystical but developmental. It is the result of an early nervous system that was required to orient almost entirely outward, toward the emotional states of caregivers. As its primary survival strategy, the internal orientation toward one's own states, one's own needs, one's own truth was secondary. And secondary things, when they are secondary long enough, atrophy. The repetition compulsion Freud named it, Jung deepened the understanding of it, is the force that drives you back into the same relational structure, over and over, wearing different faces. And it is worth being precise about why it is compulsive, because compulsive does not simply mean habitual. Habitual things can be changed through effort and intention. Compulsive things are driven by a need that operates beneath intention, a need that does not respond to reason because it was formed before reason was available as a tool. The compulsion to return to the original dynamic is driven by something that functions at the unconscious level like unfinished business. The original wound, the wound of having your emotional reality consistently subordinated to the needs of others, of having love be contingent on your self-erasure, of never having been adequately witnessed in your own right. That wound did not close. It remained open, and the psyche, in its drive toward completion, keeps returning to the site of the wound in the only way it knows how, by recreating the conditions not to suffer again, though suffering is often the result, but to try one more time to achieve a different outcome, to finally be seen, to finally be loved without condition, to finally have someone receive your care and return it with equivalent presence. And when that does not happen, when the dynamic reproduces the original wound rather than healing it, the psyche's response is not to stop trying. It is to try harder, to give more, to become more indispensable, to make the relationship work through the sheer force of your emotional generosity, because the unconscious logic insists that if you are only good enough, present enough, giving enough, The love that was conditional will finally, this time, become unconditional. It will not, and some part of you already knows this. Some part of you has known it for longer than you have been willing to acknowledge, because acknowledging it means grieving something that you have never properly grieved, not just the relationships that replicated the original wound, but the original wound itself, the grief of the child who was extraordinarily capable and extraordinarily caring and received, in return, not the unconditional presence they deserved, but a conditional approximation. That grief has been waiting. It has been waiting under all of it, under the giving, under the attunement, under the careful management of your own needs in the service of others' comfort, and it is waiting still. What begins to change first is not your behavior. This is the misunderstanding that most people carry when they imagine what psychological transformation looks like. They imagine a decision, a resolution, a moment of clarity that then produces new action. But the actual sequence is different, and it is slower, and it is considerably less satisfying than that narrative suggests. What begins to change first is perception, specifically the perception of what is actually happening in a given relational moment, stripped of the elaborate interpretive framework you have spent decades constructing to make the dynamic tolerable. You begin to see the structure, not the content, not the specific argument, the specific complaint, the specific need being presented, but the structure beneath the content, the relational architecture that has been consistent across every instance. Every person, every variation of the same fundamental arrangement, and seeing the structure does something that cannot be undone. It introduces a gap small at first, almost imperceptible, but real between the stimulus and the response, between the moment someone's emotional state activates your nervous system and the moment you move toward it. In that gap, something is beginning to exist that did not exist before, or rather, something is beginning to be reclaimed. That was exiled so early you had no conscious memory of ever having possessed it. That something is the capacity to pause inside your own experience before orienting towards someone else's. This is not a technique. It cannot be practiced in the way a breathing exercise is practiced, cannot be installed through repetition of a new habit. It is an emergence, and it emerges specifically as a consequence of what has been happening at a deeper level, the slow, largely unconscious process by which the psyche begins to withdraw the enormous quantity of energy it has been investing in maintaining the dynamic that the complex constructed. Jung called this process the withdrawal of projections, and it is worth understanding with precision what that means experientially, because the theoretical description makes it sound cleaner than it is. To withdraw a projection is not simply to stop seeing someone else as the source of something. It is to take back into yourself the psychological material you had, without knowing you were doing it, placed onto them, and that material, particularly the shadow material, the anger, the authority, the unmet need, the grief arrives back inside you with its full weight. This is why the early stages of genuine psychological shift are so frequently experienced not as liberation but as heaviness, as loss, as a kind of internal weather that has no obvious external cause and therefore cannot be explained to anyone else without sounding, even to yourself, vaguely irrational. You may have noticed, or you may be in the middle of noticing, that the relationships in your life are beginning to feel different, not because they have necessarily changed, but because you are perceiving them with incrementally less distortion. The person who has always required a great deal of your emotional attention is now appearing to you slightly more as they actually are, and slightly less as the vehicle for your unconscious hope that this time, finally, the original wound will be resolved through the right quality of giving. And what you see when you look at them with that clearer perception is not a monster. This is not about condemnation, but it is also not the version of them that your complex needed them to be. What you see is a person organized around their own needs, their own wounds, their own unconscious patterns, a person who found in you, with an accuracy that unconscious systems achieve with remarkable precision, exactly the kind of emotional availability that their own complex required. Two complexes locating each other across a room, across a conversation, across a glance. This is what most people experience as chemistry, as connection, as the mysterious sense of recognition that feels like fate. It is not fate, it is the unconscious recognizing its own. Here is the scene that belongs here. You are at a family gathering, or in a conversation with an old friend, or in the particular kind of silence that falls when someone who has always relied on your emotional labor realizes, without anything being explicitly said, that you are somehow less available than before. Nothing dramatic has happened. You have not announced a change. You have not delivered a speech about your needs or your limits or what you will no longer do. You have simply been slightly more present to yourself, slightly less reflexively organized around their comfort. And they feel it. They feel it before they can name it. Just as you once felt the emotional weather of your childhood home before you had language for what you were sensing. And their response is instructive. There is a subtle increase in the emotional demands being made, a new urgency to the need for your attention, as if the system has detected a disturbance in its equilibrium and is automatically generating corrective pressure. They may become more needy, they may become more critical, they may withdraw in a way that is clearly designed at the unconscious level to pull you back toward them through the activation of your oldest fear, which is the fear that your authentic presence, the you that is not in service to their experience, is the cause of abandonment. This is the moment that requires the most precise understanding, because it is the moment at which most people lose ground, not because they are weak, not because they have failed to understand what is happening intellectually, but because the somatic response, the physical activation of the attachment system, the body's alarm at the perceived threat of relational loss is so immediate and so overwhelming that it bypasses the understanding entirely. The body does not know that you are an adult. The body does not know that you are capable of surviving the withdrawal of conditional approval. The body knows only what it learned before words existed, that this feeling, this particular quality of relational unease, this specific texture of another person's displeasure or distance is dangerous, must be repaired, must be addressed immediately, at whatever cost to yourself, and so the pull to return to the familiar posture, to become available again, to soften whatever edge of authentic presence triggered the disturbance. That pull is not a failure of will, it is the nervous system executing a survival protocol that was written in the first years of your life. Understanding this does not make the pull disappear, but it changes your relationship to the pull. It allows you to feel it without immediately obeying it. Jung spoke of individuation as the central task of psychological life, the gradual process by which the self becomes more fully itself, less organized by the unconscious demands of the collective, of the family system, of the complexes that were formed before the individual had any capacity to choose. And individuation is never a comfortable process, because it requires the ego, the conscious, identity-bearing center of psychological life, to encounter and gradually integrate material that has been excluded from it. The shadow does not integrate quietly. The anger that has been living underground for decades does not emerge as a clean, bounded, appropriately expressed emotion. It emerges, when it begins to emerge, as something rougher and less polished than that. Something that can frighten you precisely because you have spent so long not having access to it that you have no practiced relationship with it. You may find yourself in this phase experiencing flashes of anger at things that seem disproportionate to their trigger, and they are disproportionate to their trigger. It's because the trigger is merely the opening through which decades of suppressed response is beginning to move. Or you may find yourself exhausted in a new way. Not the familiar exhaustion of emotional overextension, but a deeper exhaustion. The exhaustion of a system that has been operating under enormous pressure for a very long time and is finally beginning to release some of that pressure. The shadow contains more than anger, though anger is often the most urgent and the most frightening. It contains your authority, the deep, legitimate, internally generated sense of knowing what is true for you, what you need, where your limits are, what you will and will not participate in. This authority was not destroyed by your early adaptation. Nothing in the psyche is destroyed, this bears repeating, because the fear that you have been permanently altered, permanently diminished by what you absorbed and what you sacrificed, is one of the most persistent obstacles in this kind of work. The authority went underground. It became part of the shadow, not because it was dark or destructive, but because the environment in which you developed could not accommodate it. An authority that says, "This is too much for me. I will not continue to manage your feelings at the expense of my own." That authority, in the family system you inhabited, in the relational dynamics you inherited, was not safe. It threatened the equilibrium that your self-erasure had been recruited to maintain, and so it was suppressed. And so, now, in this gradual process of its re-emergence, it will feel unfamiliar. It will feel, at times, like aggression, when it is actually nothing more than the basic human capacity for self-definition. Consider projection from the other direction now, because this angle is equally important and considerably less often examined. If you have been the one onto whom others project their need for an unconditionally available emotional presence, and you have been repeatedly across multiple relationships, then you have been serving a function in their psychic economy that is not merely relational but structural. You have been carrying for them the part of themselves they have not integrated their own vulnerability, their own need, their own dependency. The person who presents as emotionally demanding, as consuming, as the one whose needs always somehow end up central, that person is not, in most cases, simply selfish in any uncomplicated sense. They are, at the unconscious level, externalizing material they cannot hold internally. They are placing it in you because you, with your extraordinary capacity for absorption, have made yourself available as a container. And here is what is rarely articulated clearly. Your withdrawal from that container function does not just affect the relationship. It affects their entire internal organization, because the material they have been storing in you, their denied vulnerability, their unexamined need, their unintegrated dependency, has nowhere to go when the container is removed. This is why the disruption you cause by becoming more bounded feels, to them, so disproportionately catastrophic. It is not simply that they miss you. It is that your increased self-possession destabilizes a psychic arrangement they depend on, and that destabilization will press on you hard through whatever channel is most available. Guilt, criticism, appeals to your care, sudden demonstrations of fragility, not necessarily consciously, not necessarily with any intent to manipulate, but with the full automatic force of a system that has lost its equilibrium and is generating pressure to restore it. The repetition compulsion, seen from this angle, reveals something that deserves the most careful attention. It is not only your pattern, it is a co-created structure, and it persists because both parties receive something from it, something that functions at the unconscious level as a form of psychological necessity. You receive the experience of being needed, of being indispensable, of having your identity as the capable, too generous, emotionally competent one confirmed. They receive the experience of being held, of having their overflow absorbed, of not having to develop the internal capacity to contain their own distress, because a reliable external container exists, and the system is stable. It has a terrible, costly stability as long as both parties remain in their assigned roles. What disrupts it is not conflict. Conflict, paradoxically, tends to reinforce it, because conflict activates your guilt and their demand in precisely the patterns the complex expects. What disrupts it is the quiet, persistent, incrementally increasing presence of your own interiority, the growing capacity to remain in contact with what is actually true for you, what you actually feel, what you actually need, what is actually happening, even when that contact is uncomfortable, even when it produces relational friction, even when it activates every learned instinct to smooth things over, to make it right, to return to the familiar posture of self-subordination. There is something that happens in the nervous system when you begin to do this consistently enough. And consistently is the operative word, because this is not a transformation that occurs in a single moment of resolution, but through accumulation, through the repeated experience of staying inside your own experience rather than evacuating it in the direction of someone else's need. What happens? Gradually, is a reorganization of what feels like safety. For most of your life, safety has been located relationally in the approval of others, in the absence of conflict, in the confirmed sense that you are necessary and valued and not too much. This is where safety lived, because this is where it had to live, it had no other address. But as you develop, through whatever combination of exhaustion and insight, and the slow underground work of the psyche itself, a more reliable relationship with your own interiority, safety begins to acquire a second address. It begins to live, partially, internally. Not completely, the relational need does not disappear, nor should it, but partially, enough to create a different quality of experience in moments of relational tension. Enough that you can feel the pressure to abandon yourself and recognize it as pressure rather than immediately obeying it as instruction. The stillness that arrives in this phase is not what you expected. If you imagine this point in the process at all, and most people do imagine it, in the vague, half-formed way that the psyche projects forward toward relief, you probably imagined something warmer, something that felt more like arrival. What you encounter instead is a quality of quiet that is almost austere, a settling that has none of the emotional warmth of resolution and all of the sobriety of something that is simply, at last, true. The relationships that were organized around your self-erasure have either shifted or they have fallen away. And in either case, the landscape looks different than it did. And different is not the same as better, not yet. Not in any way that is emotionally legible. There are spaces where there used to be people. There is silence where there used to be the constant low-frequency hum of managing, absorbing, attending, and that silence, which is in fact the silence of your own interior, becoming audible for possibly the first time in your adult life, feels, at least initially, less like freedom and more like a particular kind of emptiness that you do not have a precise name for. This is the quiet phase, and it is perhaps the most misunderstood passage in the entire process, because it is the phase most likely to be misread as failure. You have done the work or begun it, because this work does not complete. It only deepens, and the result appears to be, at least on the surface, a life that is smaller, fewer people making demands on you, yes, but also fewer people, less chaos, yes, but also less of the particular aliveness that the chaos, for all its cost, reliably generated. The emotional vampirism that you are no longer participating in was, among other things, stimulating. It gave your sensitivity a constant object. It gave your capacity for attunement somewhere to go, something to work on, a continuous supply of emotional material that required your most sophisticated engagement. And now that supply has been reduced, and the sensitivity that was always organized outward is beginning, slowly and sometimes painfully, to turn inward, and what it finds there is not immediately comfortable. It finds the grief that was never grieved. It finds the anger that was never expressed. It finds the accumulated weight of every moment in which you chose someone else's comfort over your own truth. And those moments are numerous, and their weight is real, and sitting with that weight without immediately converting it into action, without finding someone to help, something to fix, Some relational project to absorb your attention is among the most demanding things this process requires of you. Jung described the experience of genuine confrontation with the unconscious as a descent not metaphorically but structurally, as a movement away from the bright, managed surface of the adapted persona and into the deeper, less organized layers of the psyche where the shadow material lives alongside the genuine self that was never permitted. Full expression. This descent is disorienting in precise proportion to how thoroughly the surface was constructed. If you built your persona carefully, and you did, because careful construction was what your environment required, then the descent feels correspondingly vertiginous. You lose, temporarily, the coordinates by which you have always navigated, the role that organized your identity, the helper, the one who holds things together, the emotionally competent one. The person others rely on that role is no longer structuring your days in the way it did. And without it, the question of who you actually are becomes not a philosophical inquiry, but a lived, immediate, sometimes disquieting experience of genuine unknowing. This unknowing is not a problem to be solved. This is the point that the process most insists upon, and it is the point most likely to be misunderstood, because the ego's characteristic response to discomfort is to generate a plan, to find the next thing to optimize, the next framework to apply, the next relational project to engage with, and some of what presents itself during this phase as growth, as new understanding, as the next step. Some of it is genuine, and some of it is the old pattern wearing new clothing, the compulsion to locate identity in function, in usefulness, in having something to tend. The distinguishing quality is subtle, but real, genuine movement in this phase feels less like motivation and more like recognition. Less like the energized forward lean of someone who has found a new purpose, and more like the quiet, almost reluctant acknowledgement of something that was always true but could not previously be seen clearly enough to be accepted. What is being accepted in this phase is your own reality in its fullness, not the carefully managed, relationally calibrated version of yourself that you have presented for most of your life, but the actual texture of your inner experience, with its contradictions, its unresolved grief, its anger, its genuine needs that do not require justification, its perceptions that do not need to be checked against another person's emotional reaction before being trusted. This acceptance is not an event. It is not a moment of dramatic self-embrace. It is considerably quieter and more gradual than that. It is the slow accumulation of instances in which you remained inside your own experience rather than evacuating it, in which you registered what was true for you and did not immediately subordinate it to the management of someone else's response to it. Each of those instances is small. Individually, none of them feels like transformation. Collectively, they constitute the most significant reorganization of psychological structure that is available to a human being. Here is the scene that belongs to this phase. You are in a conversation with someone you care about, someone who matters to you, someone whose opinion of you once carried the power to fundamentally destabilize your sense of self. And they say something that is not accurate, not about the world, but about you. It is a characterization, perhaps, or an interpretation of your behavior, or a claim about your motivations that reflects their own psychological organization more than it reflects anything true about yours. And you notice the old pull, the familiar gravitational force toward acceptance, toward accommodation, toward finding the version of what they have said that you could agree with. The grain of truth in the distortion, the angle from which their perception might be valid, because finding that angle and conceding it was always the mechanism by which you restored relational warmth. You notice the pull, you feel its force, and then you do something that would have been genuinely impossible at an earlier stage of this process. You simply remain with what you know to be true. You do not argue necessarily. You do not launch a defense. You do not need to convince them. You hold internally, without drama and without performance, the clear and steady knowledge of what is actually the case. And that holding that quiet, unannounced, unremarkable act of not abandoning your own perception under relational pressure is what inner authority actually feels like when it is functioning. It does not feel like power in any external sense. It feels like ground, the mother wound, understood now from this deeper position in the process, reveals its final and most essential teaching. The wound was not simply the experience of conditional love, though that experience was real and its consequences have been substantial. The wound was the interruption of a developmental sequence that should have ended with you internalizing the function that the mother, the good enough mother, the adequately present mother, was meant to model the function of unconditional self-regard, not narcissism, not the inflation of the self at others' expense, but the basic, grounded, unsentimental regard for your own interior reality as legitimate, as mattering, as not requiring external validation before it is permitted to exist. That internalization was interrupted. The external source was unavailable or inconsistent enough that the internal structure never fully formed. And so you went looking for it in relationships, in the experience of being needed, in the role of the one who gives more than they receive, because at least in that role you were never in danger of being too much, never in danger of asking for what could not be given. The mother wound is healed not by finding a person who finally gives you what your mother could not. It is healed by completing internally the developmental sequence that was interrupted, by becoming for yourself the consistent, non-conditional, adequately present source of regard that you required and did not reliably receive. This sounds, stated directly, almost too simple, but its simplicity is not shallowness. It is the simplicity of something that operates at the most fundamental level of psychological structure. What it means in practice is this, that when you experience something, distress, need, anger, grief, confusion, the ordinary difficulty of being a person navigating a complex existence, your first movement is inward rather than outward. Not because you have abandoned the relational world, not because you have decided to need nothing from others, but because the internal orientation has been sufficiently restored that it is now available as a first resource rather than a last resort. You can feel what you feel without immediately needing it witnessed, validated, received, or resolved by another person's response. You can know what you know without needing agreement. You can hold your own experience with a quality of attention that does not require the experience to be different than it is before you are willing to give it your presence. The father wound resolves along a parallel axis. The internal father, the structuring principle, the authority, the capacity to say this is mine and this is not mine. This I will engage with and this I will not. This is my boundary and it requires no apology. That function, which was never adequately modeled in the external world, is now being built through exactly the process you have been engaged in. Every time you have registered a limit and honored it, not loudly, not dramatically, but simply by not crossing it, you have been constructing the internal father that the external one failed to model. Every time you have allowed someone else's distress to remain theirs, not with coldness, not with indifference, but with the clear, boundaried recognition that their emotional experience is their responsibility, and your compassion does not require you to absorb it as though it were your own. You have been reinforcing a structure that will, over time, become reliable, not rigid, not defended in the way that people who have never been sufficiently soft become defended, but boundaried in the way that only someone who was once genuinely too open can understand, as a form of self-respect that is also, paradoxically, a deeper form of love than the self-erasing availability it replaces. Because this is what must be understood about where you are arriving. You are not becoming less loving, you are not hardening, you are not, despite the fears that arise during the quiet phase, becoming the cold, withholding, emotionally unavailable version of a person that some part of you always feared living inside you. The shadow version of the self that gave so much. What you are becoming is weighted. The word is chosen carefully. Weighted in the sense of having gravity, of having a center of mass that is internal rather than located in whoever is currently making the most compelling demand on your attention. You are becoming a person who can be present with others without losing the thread back to yourself. You can sit with someone's pain without dissolving into it. You can offer genuine care, not performed care, not the anxious, compulsive, identity-sustaining care of the complex, but actual care that arises freely from a self that is not being depleted in the offering of it, because you are no longer giving from a place of deficit, from the exhausted reserves of someone who never fills their own interior before attending to everyone else's. The emotional vampires, and the word is not used to condemn but to describe a functional dynamic, the dynamic in which one person's vitality is systematically drawn into the service of another person's unexamined neediness. Those people do not disappear from the world when you heal. They are not transformed by your wholeness. What changes is the signal. What changes is the particular quality of availability that you were radiating without knowing you were radiating it, from the very specific frequency of your unhealed wound. The wound was the signal it broadcast at the level at which unconscious systems communicate, something that, translating into language, might read as "I will absorb what you cannot hold." I will prioritize your interior experience over my own. I will make myself small so that there is more room for you. I will not ask for what I need because I have learned that my needs create burden. That signal was receivable, was, in fact, irresistible to people whose own unconscious organization was seeking exactly that arrangement, not because they are evil, because the psyche seeks what it seeks, and what theirs sought was someone whose wound made them reliably available as a container for overflow. When the wound heals, the signal changes, not because you have decided to present yourself differently, not through any act of conscious self-management, but because the underlying structure has genuinely reorganized. And people whose inner economy requires an inexhaustible container find, without being able to articulate why, that you are no longer quite so available for that function. Not because you have become less, because you have become more, more present to yourself, more weighted in your own center, more genuinely and completely there, and therefore less available to be disappeared. You do not need to explain this to anyone. This is perhaps the clearest marker of where you have arrived. The absence of the need to justify your own interior reality to people who are not interested in understanding it. Not because you have become indifferent to being understood, the need for genuine understanding remains, and it is legitimate, and it will find its real objects as your relational world reorganizes around your actual self rather than around the persona, the complex constructed, but the specific, exhausting compulsion to explain yourself to people who require you to be different. In order for the relationship to function, that compulsion has quieted because you now understand at a level that is no longer intellectual but structural. That explanation offered to that audience is not communication. It is appeasement, and appeasement is the language of the old dynamic, the one organized around the original bargain, the one that traded your authentic self for a conditional approximation of belonging. You are no longer in that bargain, not because you renounced it in a moment of dramatic self-assertion, but because the psychic energy that sustained it has been gradually, quietly, irrevocably withdrawn into the project of becoming more fully yourself. What remains, when the complex loses its organizing force and the projections have been sufficiently withdrawn and the shadow material has begun its slow integration, is not a simpler person. You do not become easier in the sense of requiring less. You do not become more manageable in the sense of taking up less space. What you become is more coherent. The parts of you that were split off, the anger and the authority and the unmet need and the perceptions that were trained to doubt themselves, those parts are returning, one by one, imperfectly, but genuinely, into a self that is large enough to hold them, and that self weighted, boundaried, no longer organized around the management of others' emotional states at the expense of its own, capable of genuine care that does not require self-erasure as its precondition, that self is not a destination you are still traveling toward. It is what you have been underneath everything that was layered over it. It is what the wound obscured and what the healing, slowly and without ceremony, is uncovering. You are not becoming someone new. You are becoming, with increasing clarity and increasing steadiness, the person who was always there waiting, with extraordinary patience for you to stop abandoning them in favor of everyone else.